The sun had just begun its lazy descent behind the distant ridge, casting long shadows across the dirt road I had followed for 3 relentless days. My horse's hooves churned the dry earth, kicking up clouds of dust that clung to my jeans and coat. I clutched the deed in my hand, its weight both literal and symbolic. It represented everything I had saved, every sacrifice, every quiet moment of ambition. A new beginning awaited me, a life far from the suffocating expectations of town, the endless arguments, the ceaseless judgment. A life of solitude, fresh air, and hard work. Or so I thought. As the farmhouse appeared on the horizon, my chest tightened. The structure was larger than the small cabin I had imagined, its timber weathered by years of relentless wind and sun. But it was the figures on the porch that made my heart slam against my ribs. 3 women stood there, like statues carved from muscle and resolve, each radiating authority and confidence I couldn't have imagined encountering in the middle of nowhere. Their presence alone shifted the weight of the property in my hands, making the legal deed feel like a fragile piece of paper against the undeniable gravity of their bodies. The tallest among them moved first. Her arms, corded with muscle, seemed capable of bending metal as she stepped forward. A smile crossed her face, but it didn't reach her eyes, the kind of cold, piercing blue eyes that could read a man like an open ledger. My instincts screamed caution. Behind her, the other 2 flanked her sides with quiet menace. Their silence was heavy, deliberate. Each step I took closer to the house felt like a test, and the tension was electric, crawling up my spine like frostbite. I told myself to breathe, to focus on the rational part of me. I had the papers. I had the law on my side. 3 days of travel, 2 states crossed, endless miles of rough terrain, all for this moment. And yet, as I held the deed in my hands, the edges of the paper seemed flimsy, almost laughably inadequate against the force that radiated from them. The woman in front, the apparent leader, tilted her head slightly, assessing me in a way that made my stomach tighten. She didn't speak at first, letting the silence do its work. When she finally moved, her words cut sharper than any blade. She knew my name. Boone Whitmore. The casual ease with which she pronounced it, the intimacy in the delivery, sent a chill through me. How did these strangers, in a place I had thought isolated and private, know who I was? The promises of privacy from the seller, Mark, as he had called himself, felt suddenly hollow. My mind raced through every conversation, every transaction, every assurance. Nothing made sense anymore. They were no ordinary residents. No neighbors, no squatters who had wandered onto the land out of ignorance. There was deliberateness in the way they stood, a predator's precision in their gaze, a calculated expectation in every movement. The second woman, broader and darker-haired, radiated a silent intensity, and the third, a fiery redhead with freckles dotting her broad shoulders, exuded something almost playful, yet undeniably dangerous. The 3 of them together made a tableau of dominance and control that made my pulse hammer in ways I had never known. 3 days of anticipation, all boiled down to this impossible confrontation. I reminded myself of the logic. Deeds were legal, documents binding. Yet the air between us was charged with something beyond legality, something I could feel pressing against my chest like physical force. My hand instinctively moved toward the rifle strapped across the saddle. It wasn't desire I felt, certainly not, but the raw, primal urge to protect, to assert control over the situation, surged. As the leader studied me, I realized the truth. This wasn't a simple dispute over property. The air was thick with history, with unspoken arrangements, promises made and broken. Marcus Vance, the seller, was suddenly a shadow looming over everything, a ghost whose betrayal had planted the seeds for the scenario I now faced. The questions raced through my mind. What kind of arrangements? How binding could they be? How far had these women been wronged, and how deeply had the deceit affected them? I tried to anchor myself in reason, to remind myself of the law, of the clear-cut ownership, but their confidence was magnetic, and the three of them weren't just confident. They were accomplished, capable, and unyielding. Each step I took toward the farmhouse was a negotiation with my own nerves, each breath a measure of courage I wasn't sure I possessed. The documents in my hand seemed increasingly inadequate, trivial compared to the presence of the women, the legacy of the previous owner, and the weight of what awaited. And then it hit me, the very thing I hadn't been ready to consider. This wasn't just about land, not really. It was about control, loyalty, and a past that had been forcibly attached to my future. I was standing at the precipice of an arrangement I hadn't agreed to, facing three women whose lives and ambitions had been enmeshed with a man who had sold me this property. The reality pressed down on me. The property I thought would be mine, a sanctuary, was now a crucible. And my decision, whatever it would be, had to be made in the shadow of promises I hadn't made and obligations I had never intended to inherit. I dismounted slowly, trying to appear calm, though my heart pounded in a rhythm that threatened to betray me. Every instinct screamed caution, yet another part of me, a part one hadn't acknowledged, was curious. What had these women built here? What had Marcus taken from them? And what, if anything, did he expect me to step into? As I moved closer, the sunlight catching the dust in the air, I realized that the answers would shape not just my ownership of this land, but the very life I thought I was beginning anew. And in that moment, standing in the dry heat of late afternoon with three towering figures regarding me like living statues, I understood one thing with crystal clarity. Nothing about this purchase, nothing about this property, nothing about this encounter would ever be simple. The farmhouse door was heavier than I expected, its frame worn smooth from decades of weather and use. As I stepped inside, the air shifted, the smell of pine, soil, and something faintly floral wrapped around me. I paused, letting my eyes adjust to the dim interior, taking in the careful order that contrasted sharply with the imposing aura of the women outside. It was clear that this place had not been abandoned or neglected. Every beam, every piece of furniture, every simple decoration spoke of meticulous care and labor. I moved slowly through the main room, my boots scuffing softly against the wooden floorboards. There were no signs of chaos, no clutter that would betray the presence of multiple adults sharing the space. Yet there was an unmistakable vitality to the place, a sense that it had been lived in intensely. I noticed the kitchen first. Large and functional, it seemed designed for both efficiency and comfort. Copper pots hung from racks above the counters, their surfaces polished to a warm glow. On the table, a few tools lay scattered, hints of recent activity. The smell of herbs, dried and bundled near the window, mingled with the faint scent of smoked wood. As I moved further into the house, I began to notice small details that hinted at the past labor that had gone into this land. Charts and notebooks were stacked neatly on a small desk in the corner. Notes in careful handwriting, sketches of irrigation channels, calculations for crop rotation, and records of livestock growth filled the pages. Someone had invested time, skill, and knowledge into turning this remote plot into something productive and sustainable. The thought made the weight of my own legal documents seem trivial. Here were living proofs of work, of dedication, of resilience, tangible achievements far beyond any promise a deed could provide. I found myself lingering near a window that looked out over the fields. From this vantage point, I could see the irrigation system Ruth had mentioned earlier, the channels carved with precision, directing water from a distant spring across the carefully cultivated plots. I could see neat rows of vegetables, small grains, and the outlines of pastures dotted with healthy cattle grazing contentedly. In the fading sunlight, the land seemed almost alive, a testament to effort and persistence. Every ditch, every fence, every small patch of tilled earth was a story, and these women had written it all. A sudden sound drew my attention, a low murmur of movement from upstairs. I froze, heart thudding, half expecting confrontation, half curious. Whatever was going on here, these women operated with a seamless understanding of the land and of each other. The house itself seemed to hum with their presence, the harmony of their labor, their routines woven into every corner. I realized then that this wasn't simply a home or a farm. It was a microcosm of collaboration, a structure designed around efficiency, trust, and shared effort. I took a deep breath, trying to reconcile the mental image of these imposing, almost predatory women with the life they had created. My initial fear, the instinctive urge to protect myself and assert ownership, clashed with admiration I couldn't suppress. Here was proof of competence, intelligence, and endurance, and they had been doing it long before I arrived. My role in this dynamic, for the first time, felt uncertain. I was a stranger stepping into a world that had already been carefully constructed, a world with rules I didn't yet understand. I wandered into a smaller room, a sort of informal study. On the wall, maps of the surrounding territory were pinned with markers and notes. Trails to neighboring settlements, water sources, and grazing paths were clearly delineated. Evidence of trade routes, times of year when certain markets were accessible, and distances to the nearest towns had been meticulously documented. It became clear that Marcus had not only left promises unpaid, but had underestimated the capability of the women he abandoned. They had not only maintained the property, they had expanded its potential far beyond what he, or I, might have imagined. Ruth's ingenuity with irrigation, Magdalene's management of livestock, Helena's organizational command, it all painted a picture of a trio who had become far more than partners to Marcus. They were creators, strategists, and survivors, forged together by necessity and hardened by betrayal. And now, they were waiting for me to step into the consequences of a contract I had never signed, a debt I had not incurred. The reality pressed down harder than the heat of the afternoon sun. I was no longer simply a buyer of property. I had entered a living ecosystem, one that had been sustained by the sweat, skill, and endurance of three formidable women, and it had been their lives before mine even existed in this context. I walked back through the main room, my mind racing with possibilities and implications. These women had made this land flourish. Marcus had left them in ruins, and now his absence had positioned me as an unwitting participant in a complex, morally entangled scenario. My legal documents gave me ownership, but the reality of the people, their labor, and their expectations introduced a tension I had never experienced. I felt the full weight of responsibility, not just to the land, but to the lives entwined with it. Stepping onto the porch again, I looked at them, standing silently where I had first seen them. Helena's gaze caught mine, a subtle shift of expression that suggested a mixture of hope, challenge, and assessment. Ruth and Magdalene flanked her as before, their presence unyielding yet not hostile. The air between us was charged, not with simple confrontation, but with the gravity of interwoven histories, promises, and survival. I realized then that my next moves would define more than my ownership. They would determine whether I became a partner, a bystander, or a threat. The choice was mine, but it was complicated by the undeniable truth. These women had built something extraordinary here, and whatever path I chose, I would need to acknowledge and respect what they had already accomplished. The faint scent of lavender and pine still clung to the air, reminding me that there was more than business at stake. There was life, continuity, and perhaps even something I had never anticipated: connection. I mounted my horse again, circling the property, tracing the boundaries with my eyes. Every step, every fence, every furrow in the field reflected labor, planning, and resilience. I could feel the subtle hum of purpose emanating from the land itself, a pulse that mirrored the women's own strength. The isolation I had sought now seemed almost irrelevant. What mattered was not being alone, but understanding the depth of what had already been created, and what I might be called to join. For the first time, I understood the scale of the decision that lay before me. This wasn't just about land. It was about legacy, responsibility, and an intricate network of human bonds that I hadn't chosen but could not ignore. And in that quiet realization, standing amidst the fields I had hoped to claim as my own, I felt the first flicker of comprehension. I had stepped into someone else's life, and now it was up to me whether to disrupt it, respect it, or become part of it. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking the perimeter of the property, each step revealing another layer of labor and dedication. Fences, meticulously mended and reinforced, traced the edges of grazing fields, their wooden posts sun-bleached but sturdy. Cattle grazed calmly, their contentment a testament to the care they had received. Chickens pecked at the earth near the coop, the faint scent of straw and feed mingling with the warm, dusty air. The irrigation channels, Ruth's signature accomplishment, split and branched like a network of veins, feeding every section of the property with precision. Everywhere I looked, I saw work that was deliberate, skillful, and enduring. I couldn't stop thinking about the arrangements Marcus had left behind. The legal documents he had signed, supposedly transferring ownership, had failed to account for the complexity of human relationships. I had assumed a property transaction was a simple matter: money exchanged, papers signed, and boundaries respected. I had been wrong. Marcus had involved these women in ways that blurred the line between business and personal, intertwining obligations and promises in a web I hadn't anticipated. And now, I was caught in the center. The sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching long across the land, as I found myself near the barn. I ran my hands along the rough beams, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my fingers, imagining the countless hours spent maintaining this structure. I realized that every corner of this property bore the imprint of Helena, Ruth, and Magdalene. Marcus may have owned the title, but the soul of the land belonged to them. And the more I considered it, the more I understood how carefully they had built not just a home, but a system, a life, that was resilient, self-sufficient, and deeply interconnected. Memories began to surface as I pieced together the fragments of their story. Marcus had arrived 3 years ago, full of charm and promises, speaking of partnership and shared vision. At first, it seemed genuine, a plan to work together to cultivate this land. But promises are fragile things when spoken without follow-through. Within months, Marcus had begun withdrawing, seeking an exit while leaving the women to shoulder the burdens he had promised to share. He had taken what he wanted: work, loyalty, even affection, and left behind a paper trail that was supposed to bind others to his failed commitments. I felt a bitter knot form in my stomach. How had they endured it? How had they not only survived, but thrived despite betrayal? The answer was evident in every fence, every furrow, every carefully tended plant and animal. These women were not victims. They were architects of their own resilience. Their competence was intimidating, and it should have frightened me, yet I couldn't help being drawn to it. Each accomplishment was a challenge, a statement that they could survive without Marcus, and perhaps, if they chose, even without me. As I moved closer to the edge of the fields, I began to notice the subtler details. Notes pinned to wooden stakes indicated crop rotation schedules, reminders for soil enrichment, and observations of weather patterns. These weren't just practical considerations. They were evidence of long-term thinking, an investment in sustainability that went far beyond simple subsistence. I realized that their work had not been haphazard or reactive. It had been strategic, methodical, and demanding. It required trust and coordination, skills that had been honed through necessity and perhaps through shared hardship. And then there was the unspoken layer, the one Marcus papers could never capture, the bond between the 3 women. The way the irrigation channels branched, the grazing fields divided, the coops and barns arranged, it all reflected not just practicality, but an understanding of one another's strengths, weaknesses, and rhythms. They had built a life together, not out of choice but out of survival, and in that shared existence, They had created a system of mutual reliance that went far beyond legal obligations. The thought made my pulse quicken. This wasn't just a farm. It was a living network of care, loyalty, and subtle power, and I was now invited to step into it. By the time I returned to the farmhouse, the sky was a deep, bruised purple, the first stars beginning to pierce the twilight. I could see Helena, Ruth, and Magdalene moving around inside, their silhouettes framed by the warm glow of lamplight. Each carried themselves with the quiet confidence of those who had built something that could withstand adversity. I realized that whatever choice I made, I was facing a landscape far more complex than any simple property dispute. Marcus had created a vacuum, but these women had filled it with life, structure, and meaning. I dismounted and stood in the yard, my gaze sweeping over the fields, the buildings, the intricate network of labor and care. The weight of expectation pressed against me again, but this time it was tempered by a growing admiration. Their work was undeniable. Their survival, their competence, their coordination, it all demanded respect. I could no longer think of this as simply a transaction. This was about joining an ecosystem, understanding its rules, and finding a place where I could contribute without diminishing what had already been established. And yet, beneath my growing respect, there was a persistent unease. The arrangements Marcus had left behind were not just financial. They were personal, moral, and complex. I had never agreed to them, and yet I was now confronted with the reality that they existed. I would have to navigate not only the labor and strategy of running this property, but also the emotional and ethical entanglements that had been created long before I arrived. I paused at the porch steps, looking up at the windows where soft lamplight flickered. The women had been waiting for me, anticipating my arrival, evaluating my response. Their expectations, their past suffering, and the labor they had invested into this land, all of it coalesced into a single pressing question. Would I step into their world with understanding and respect, or would I retreat, leaving them to the consequences of Marcus' betrayal alone? The thought of retreating felt hollow, even cowardly. I had sought solitude, a fresh start, and instead I had discovered a living testament to perseverance and resilience. Whatever my future held, it would not be isolated or simple. It would be intertwined with theirs, shaped by the history they carried, and guided by the choices I now faced. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the caution and the fear, a part of me recognized the extraordinary potential in that entanglement, the possibility that the life I had imagined might pale in comparison to what they could offer, both in partnership and in something more human, more intricate, and perhaps even more fulfilling. Morning arrived with a crispness that I hadn't felt in years. The air smelled of damp earth and freshly turned soil, carrying the subtle sweetness of grass and flowers that had been planted and nurtured with care. I woke early, not out of obligation, but because the property seemed to demand my attention. From the porch, I could see the land stretching out like a living map. Each field, each pasture, each garden plot an intricate puzzle piece shaped by hands that had spent months, if not years, perfecting them. Helena was already outside, moving with deliberate precision as she inspected the fences along the far edge of the pasture. Her long legs and muscular frame allowed her to stride with purpose, every movement efficient and fluid. Even from a distance, her authority over the land and her control over the operation were clear. It was not just physical strength. It was the quiet command of someone who understood every inch of the property, every animal, and every plant. I felt a mix of awe and intimidation, realizing that my idea of a fresh start was no longer my own. I was stepping into a world that had been mastered by 3 women whose skill and confidence far surpassed anything I had prepared for. I mounted my horse and followed Helena at a careful distance, wanting to observe without intruding. As we moved along the pasture, she pointed out areas where the soil needed reinforcement and where irrigation channels had been redirected. I could see Ruth ahead, kneeling near one of the water gates, inspecting the flow and adjusting the small sluices to optimize water distribution. Every movement she made was deliberate and measured, revealing an intimate understanding of engineering and environmental systems. The precision of her work impressed me, making my earlier assumptions about the simplicity of frontier life seem naive. Magdalene was checking the livestock, moving among the cattle with a quiet confidence that demanded respect. Her presence was different from Helena's authoritative command or Ruth's meticulous precision. She had a fierceness in her gaze, a quiet insistence that everything under her care was accounted for and protected. Watching her, I realized that each of these women brought a unique strength to their collective efforts, and together they had created a system that was far more advanced than I could have imagined. As the morning sun climbed, the land came alive. Birds flitted among the trees, their songs carrying across the fields. The cattle moved in response to Magdalene's careful guidance. The irrigation channels hummed with steady water flow, and the gardens glistened with the dew of the early hour. I couldn't help but feel a growing admiration for what they had accomplished. This was no ordinary farm. It was a living testament to dedication, strategy, and resilience. Every detail spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of the land. I dismounted to examine the irrigation channels more closely, walking along the carefully dug trenches that carried water from the distant spring. Ruth noticed my presence but didn't interrupt her work, her focus unwavering. I traced the flow of water with my fingers, marveling at the precision and thought that had gone into its construction. The system was designed not just to nourish plants, but to maximize efficiency, conserve resources, and ensure sustainability across seasons. I realized that I had underestimated the depth of skill these women possessed. The more I observed, the more I understood the unspoken dynamics at play. Helena's leadership, Ruth's technical expertise, and Magdalene's protective vigilance had created a harmony that was rare, especially in a world that often relied on brute force and isolation. This was not merely survival, it was mastery. And yet, beneath the efficiency and precision, there was a subtle intimacy between them, a bond forged through shared effort and mutual reliance. The realization made my pulse quicken, a strange combination of respect and something deeper, something I couldn't yet name. By late morning, we were back near the farmhouse, having completed a full survey of the land. Helena turned her gaze toward me, and for a moment, the authoritative mask softened. There was a hint of expectation, a silent evaluation of how I had navigated the property, observed their work, and absorbed the complexity of what they had built. Ruth approached, her posture relaxed yet confident, and Magdalene followed with the calm assurance of someone who had the final say over the livestock. Standing among them, I felt the weight of choice pressing down again. This was no longer a matter of ownership, but of participation. I realized that the arrangement Marcus had left behind was not a trap in the traditional sense. It was a challenge, a call to prove myself worthy of joining a system that had been meticulously constructed and maintained without him. And I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that stepping away now would not simply be leaving a farm. It would be abandoning the lives, the work, and the achievements of 3 extraordinary women who had invested everything into this land. The morning faded into afternoon as I helped with minor tasks, careful to follow instructions and observe rather than take control. Even these small contributions required attentiveness and precision, and I quickly realized that casual participation would not suffice. This was about commitment, understanding, and trust. By the time the sun reached its zenith, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. I was beginning to comprehend not only the physical demands of managing the land, but the emotional and moral stakes intertwined with every decision, every task, every shared moment of labor. As we returned to the farmhouse, the weight of the past and the responsibility of the present settled over me like a second skin. I had entered this property seeking isolation and renewal, yet I now found myself immersed in a complex ecosystem of work, loyalty, and human connection. The question of whether to honor the obligations left by Marcus had transformed into a far deeper inquiry. Could I integrate myself into this intricate balance without disrupting it? Could I earn a place not merely as an owner, but as a partner in every sense that mattered? For the first time since arriving, I felt the faint stirrings of possibility, not just for the land, not just for survival, but for connection, collaboration, and a future that was entirely unexpected. The three women had built more than a farm. They had created a world that demanded engagement, respect, and careful consideration. And I was now standing at the threshold of that world, unsure whether to step fully into it or remain on the outside, observing from a distance. The choice would not be easy, but one thing had become clear. I could no longer consider this land mine alone. Ownership was meaningless without understanding, participation, and the recognition of the women whose hands had shaped every inch of this property. And as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the fields, I realized that whatever path I chose next would define not only my future, but the future of the lives already intertwined with this land. That evening, the farmhouse felt smaller, warmer, and yet heavier with the weight of history and expectation. I sat at the wooden table, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the room, and watched as Helena, Ruth, and Magdalene moved about with a quiet rhythm that belied the intensity of the day. They worked efficiently, almost instinctively, and I realized I was still learning how to read the subtle cues that guided their interaction with each other and with the land. This wasn't just farming, it was choreography, and each of them knew every step by heart. Then came the ledger. Magdalene brought it out with a solemn expression, setting it on the table in front of me. I stared at it for a long moment, the weight of the pages like a physical force pressing against my chest. Marcus had left more than unfulfilled promises. He had left a trail of debts that were substantial, far beyond what I had anticipated when I agreed to purchase the property. Supplies, equipment, arrangements with local traders, all unpaid, all now hanging in the balance. I flipped open the pages, my eyes scanning columns of numbers, dates, and annotations. The total sum was enough to make a man reconsider any notion of a fresh start. I felt a cold knot of fear and responsibility tighten in my stomach. This was no longer a simple transaction. It was a tangled web of obligations that extended beyond money, beyond labor, beyond anything I had experienced in my previous life. Each entry told a story. Goods ordered on trust, labor invested in expectation of fair return, promises made and broken. Marcus' charm had left behind a vacuum, and the women had been forced to fill it with their own sweat, their own endurance, and in some cases, their own hearts. The magnitude of what they had endured struck me harder than I expected. Every figure in the ledger was a reminder of betrayal, of resilience, of trust exploited. And yet, there was a quiet pride in the way Magdalene presented it, in the way Ruth added context and Helena corrected minor miscalculations. They were not pleading for my mercy. They were presenting facts, laying bare the consequences, and silently asking whether I would rise to meet the challenge. I ran my hands over the rough surface of the table, trying to ground myself. I had money, yes, from previous holdings, from careful investments and savings. I could settle these debts, cover the immediate obligations, and inject capital to maintain and expand operations. But money alone wouldn't resolve the deeper issues, the trust, the coordination, the years of shared labor and suffering. If I stepped in, I needed to understand not just the finances, but the dynamics, the relationships, and the expectations that had developed in my absence. Helena spoke first, her voice steady yet tinged with an emotion I couldn't quite name. She explained the most urgent obligations, debts with local traders who had shown patience out of respect for the work that had been done. Ruth followed, describing the equipment that had been purchased on credit, tools and machinery essential for irrigation, cultivation, and livestock management. Magdalene finished, detailing arrangements with neighboring settlements, the livestock exchanges, and the agreements that had been carefully documented but left unpaid when Marcus disappeared. I listened, my mind racing. This wasn't merely a financial puzzle. It was a challenge that required strategic thinking, meticulous organization, and an understanding of both human and material resources. The women had been running the operation alone, and they had done it successfully, but the pressure was immense, and the margin for error slim. I could feel the enormity of responsibility pressing against me. If I failed, the consequences would not be mine alone. They would fall on the 3 women who had already suffered enough. As I absorbed the details, I also began to notice subtler layers. The way Helena's jaw tightened when she mentioned unpaid bills, the way Ruth's hands moved with precise, almost anxious gestures as she explained the irrigation systems, the way Magdalene's gaze lingered on me as if silently testing my resolve. They were not only assessing my ability to contribute to the work, they were measuring my capacity to honor their labor, their loyalty, and their trust. The ledger was as much a moral test as a financial one. I realized then that the land, the debts, the arrangements, and even Marcus' betrayal had all converged into a single point: my decision. I could walk away, leave the challenges for them to bear alone, and retain the legal title to a property that had already been shaped and mastered without me. Or I could step forward, accept the responsibility, and begin the delicate process of integrating myself into their lives, their work, and the fragile trust that had survived years of disappointment. The room grew quiet as I pondered the implications. I could feel the sun's last rays fading through the windows, the shadows lengthening and merging into the dim interior. It was in that quiet that I understood the stakes were far more than monetary. Accepting the debts, helping manage the operations, and stepping into this partnership would require a commitment that went beyond business. It would demand patience, empathy, and a willingness to engage with a system that had been carefully honed by 3 formidable women. And yet, as daunting as it was, there was an undercurrent of possibility that made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't ignore. This wasn't merely about settling debts or maintaining a farm. It was about becoming part of something larger than myself, something resilient, intricate, and alive. It was about trust, collaboration, and perhaps even a connection that transcended the ordinary definitions of partnership. The ledger, the debts, the meticulous documentation, all of it was a test, and I realized that the choice to step forward could change the trajectory of all our lives. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the columns of numbers, and felt the gravity of my position. Marcus had abandoned them, leaving chaos disguised as opportunity. But the women had survived, and they had thrived. Now, the decision rested with me, to retreat into the safety of isolation and legal ownership, or to step into the complexity, uncertainty, and potential of joining their world. I could almost feel the pulse of the land, steady and insistent, echoing the silent expectation of the 3 women who had already given everything to preserve it. For the first time since arriving, I understood that this was not a mere transaction, not a casual partnership, but a turning point. Whatever I chose, I was irrevocably entangled in the lives, labor, and trust of Helena, Ruth, and Magdalene. And deep within, a quiet part of me recognized that the challenge, however daunting, carried a potential far greater than anything I had imagined. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the rooster crowing, the sun spilling through the kitchen windows and casting warm light across the worn wooden floor. The farmhouse felt alive in a way I hadn't anticipated. I realized, with a mix of apprehension and curiosity, that my presence here was no longer just a matter of ownership. It was about participation. Today, I would begin the practical immersion into the life these women had built, and I knew instinctively that observation alone would not suffice. I started with the livestock, under Magdalene's careful supervision. She led me through the pasture with a quiet authority, explaining the routines and the reasoning behind each task. Feeding schedules, rotational grazing patterns, health checks, and breeding considerations. All of it was part of an intricate system that I had never imagined when I'd first dreamed of starting fresh in the isolation of a remote property. Her voice carried calmness, but every word was loaded with expectation, and I realized she was assessing my attentiveness as much as my physical ability. Handling the cattle was harder than I expected. Their strength and unpredictable movements tested my coordination and patience. Magdalene's guidance was firm but patient, correcting my grip, my stance, and even the way I moved in relation to the animals. As I followed her directions, I felt a strange rhythm emerging, a cadence that matched her own. By the time we finished checking the herd, I was exhausted, but there was also a subtle thrill in knowing that my efforts, however clumsy, were meaningful in this environment. Next, Ruth took me to the irrigation channels. Walking alongside her, I marveled at the precision of her work. Water flowed through each channel with careful calculation, feeding garden plots, pastures, and livestock areas alike. She explained the engineering principles behind the system, the gradients, the water volume, the timing of each sluice, and I listened intently, realizing that every adjustment she made was part of a larger orchestration designed to maximize efficiency and sustainability. I followed her hands and eyes, making minor adjustments under her supervision, and for the first time, I felt a sense of participation that went beyond manual labor. Helena observed from a distance, her commanding presence a constant reminder that every task, every decision, carried consequence. When she finally approached, she outlined the broader strategy: crop rotation, trade logistics, and long-term planning for soil fertility. Her instructions were precise, almost clinical, yet beneath the rigor, there was a subtle encouragement, a recognition that I was learning, that I could contribute. I felt a tentative pride at being entrusted with this knowledge, and a creeping awareness of how much responsibility these women had carried alone for years. As the sun climbed higher, we moved together from task to task. The farmhouse, the barn, the coops, the irrigation channels, and the pastures, all became arenas of shared labor and observation. I began to notice details I had missed before: the way Ruth's hands moved almost instinctively to check water flow, the subtle exchanges of glance and gesture between Helena and Magdalene, and the small but powerful ways they communicated trust and coordination without words. Their bond was evident not just in what they had built, but in how they moved, spoke, and interacted. By midday, we paused near the edge of the property, taking in the expanse of land we had surveyed. Sweat streaked my face, and my muscles ached in ways I hadn't experienced in years, yet there was an undeniable satisfaction in the tangible progress we had made. I began to understand that the work itself was only part of the partnership. Equally important was the trust, the understanding, and the unspoken agreements that guided every decision, every action, and every adjustment. The land was a living system, but so was the network of relationships that had kept it thriving in Marcus' absence. As we returned to the farmhouse, I realized that I was beginning to feel a connection not just to the land, but to the people who had shaped it. Their competence was magnetic, drawing me into their rhythm, their methodology, and their subtle social dynamic. Even in casual conversation, I could sense the layers of history, the lingering impact of past betrayals, and the depth of loyalty they had cultivated toward one another. Every detail, from the careful layout of the garden plots to the way they anticipated each other's movements, reflected an intimacy that was professional, personal, and profoundly human all at once. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the farmhouse glowed with warmth, and the day's work settled into memory and routine. We shared a modest meal, the conversation light but meaningful, touching on practical matters, trade arrangements, and plans for expansion. I realized I had been accepted as more than a visitor. I was beginning to be treated as a participant, someone whose presence mattered in both the work and the rhythm of the household. And yet, beneath the satisfaction and fatigue, there was an undercurrent of tension and expectation that reminded me this integration was far from complete. As I lay in the guest room that night, muscles sore but mind buzzing, I reflected on the day. The debts Marcus had left behind were still looming, the legal and moral obligations pressing against my conscience. But more than that, I had glimpsed the extraordinary potential of joining these women, not as an outsider, not as a mere property owner, but as a partner in the work, the life, and the delicate balance they had maintained for years. It was daunting, exhilarating, and strangely magnetic. For the first time, I felt the weight and the allure of responsibility. I could see, clearly, that this property, this life, and these women were more than a fresh start. They were a challenge, an opportunity, and perhaps even the chance for a connection I had never anticipated. The choice before me was no longer about legality or isolation. It was about whether I had the courage to step fully into the complexity, the labor, and the intimacy that this place demanded. The following morning, the sun rose slowly over the horizon, painting the fields in shades of gold and amber. The farm seemed to breathe with life, and I felt an odd mixture of anticipation and dread. Today, I was to meet the traders, the very people to whom the debts left behind by Marcus Vance had been incurred. I had seen the numbers in the ledger, but numbers on a page carried a different weight than the expectation of men who had extended credit in trust. Helena, Ruth, and Magdalene had prepared meticulously for this meeting. Helena reviewed the ledger again, tracing columns with a practiced finger, making sure every figure matched the goods and the arrangements. Ruth double-checked the water and crop forecasts, and Magdalene inspected the livestock, noting which animals could be leveraged for immediate trade or sale. Each action was precise, deliberate, and methodical, revealing a seamless coordination that spoke volumes about their experience and trust in one another. I rode with them into the nearby settlement, a small cluster of buildings where traders lived and worked. Helena led the way with quiet confidence, her stature commanding respect even before words were exchanged. Ruth followed, documents in hand, and Magdalene closed the rear, her gaze scanning the surroundings with protective vigilance. I felt like an observer at first, yet acutely aware that my presence was now part of the equation. This wasn't just about debts. It was about demonstrating capability, trustworthiness, and understanding of the system these women had built in Marcus' absence. The first trader was a grizzled man named Corbin, known for his meticulous records and careful dealings. Helena approached with a mixture of professionalism and assertive calm. I could see the subtle shift in his demeanor. He recognized her authority, and he responded with a cautious respect reserved for someone who had managed resources and obligations effectively. Ruth presented the documents, laying out the amounts owed and the plan for repayment. Magdalene added details about livestock and produce schedules, clarifying timelines and capacity for supply. I watched, fascinated, as they navigated the negotiation with a fluidity and subtlety I hadn't expected. Each word, each gesture, was calculated to reassure, assert, and balance authority with diplomacy. I realized then that this was not merely a farm. It was an ecosystem of trust, negotiation, and careful strategy. Marcus may have abandoned these women, but they had learned to manage both the tangible and intangible assets of their enterprise with a skill that demanded respect. When it came my turn to speak, my voice carried a tentative steadiness. I addressed the outstanding debts, acknowledging our commitment to settle them promptly. The traders' initial skepticism faded as I outlined practical plans for payment, informed by Helena's strategic guidance. I could sense their cautious approval, and the subtle nods of agreement between the three women reassured me that I was integrating successfully into their framework. It wasn't just about money. It was about demonstrating comprehension, reliability, and the willingness to act in alignment with the group. As the negotiations progressed, I observed the dynamics among the women more closely. Helena's authority was clear, but she deferred subtly to Ruth on technical matters, trusting her expertise with irrigation and crop yield projections. Magdalene, meanwhile, managed the contingencies, anticipating objections and countering them with calm precision. I marveled at the unspoken communication that allowed them to function as a unit, each aware of the other's strengths, weaknesses, and tendencies, creating a synergy that was far greater than the sum of its parts. By the end of the morning, the traders had agreed to revised payment schedules, and I felt a cautious relief settle over me. We had navigated the debts, reassured the creditors, and maintained the integrity of the women's labor and reputation. But more importantly, I had seen firsthand the depth of coordination, trust, and subtle negotiation that defined their partnership. It was not only professional, it was profoundly human. Their bond extended beyond the practical, into a realm of loyalty, respect, and shared responsibility that I had never experienced before. On the ride back, the tension of the morning began to give way to a reflective quiet. I could feel a shift in myself, a recognition that the challenge Marcus left behind was far more complex than simple debt. It was about trust, accountability, and integration into a system that demanded both competence and empathy. I realized that my willingness to step into this world, fully, earnestly, was as critical as any financial settlement. That evening, back at the farmhouse, the air felt charged with a new sense of possibility. I had contributed in a tangible way, and the women's subtle approval reminded me that I was not just an observer, but a participant in their intricate ecosystem. The work we had done together, the negotiations I had undertaken, and the understanding I had begun to develop were all building toward something larger. A shared life, a partnership that combined practical collaboration with emotional depth. As the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the fields, I felt a growing sense of alignment. The debts were being managed, the property was thriving, and I was beginning to understand my place within this unique structure. And beneath it all, a subtle awareness lingered, a recognition that the connection I felt with Helena, Ruth, and Magdalene was deepening, shaped not just by labor and obligation, but by shared trust, shared responsibility, and the possibility of something profoundly human and enduring. By nightfall, as we gathered for dinner, I felt the subtle pulse of anticipation and unspoken questions. The challenges ahead were numerous, the responsibilities immense, but for the first time, I sensed that I was not alone in facing them. The women had built a foundation of strength, trust, and skill, and now I had a chance to integrate into that foundation, not merely as an owner, but as a partner, a participant, and perhaps something more. Returning to the farmhouse that evening, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The sun had dipped behind the hills, leaving long shadows across the yard, and the air smelled faintly of earth, animals, and wood smoke from the fireplace. I had spent the day negotiating debts, learning the subtle art of trade and repayment, and beginning to understand the intricacies of their carefully managed operations. Yet as I stepped inside, I realized the real challenge wasn't the land, the ledger, or even the negotiations. It was the people themselves, and the bonds they shared that had existed long before I arrived. Helena was moving about the kitchen, preparing a simple meal, her strength evident even in the way she handled the pots and utensils. Ruth hovered near the pantry, gathering ingredients, her careful movements deliberate yet graceful. Magdalene, as always, seemed to occupy the space between them, an anchor who balanced their interactions with an unspoken understanding. Watching them, I began to notice the small details, the way their eyes met across the room, the subtle gestures of acknowledgement, the way tension or agreement was communicated without words. I had assumed that joining their lives would primarily involve labor and shared responsibility, but I was starting to understand that there was a layer beneath the surface, a network of emotional intricacies that was far more subtle, delicate, and powerful. Each woman had her own personality, her own strengths and vulnerabilities, and yet together they created a dynamic that was almost symbiotic. Trust, affection, and perhaps even longing had woven themselves into the fabric of their relationship, forming a structure that was at once resilient and deeply human. Dinner was a quiet affair, punctuated by occasional conversation about the farm, the livestock, and plans for the next few weeks. But beneath the practical discussion, I could feel the undercurrent of attention directed toward me. Not overt, not demanding, but attentive and evaluative. I realized they were gauging my response, measuring how I would fit into their world, not just as a participant in the labor, but as a potential partner in the more intimate, emotional dimensions of their lives. After the meal, I offered to help clear the dishes, and in doing so, found myself in a position to interact more personally with each of them. Helena spoke with a quiet intensity, her gaze lingering just a moment too long on mine, revealing the subtle interplay of authority and vulnerability. Ruth's touch was gentle, her presence calming, and I felt a strange warmth at her quiet attentiveness. Magdalene's laughter, sharp but genuine, drew me in, breaking down barriers I hadn't realized I had erected. As the evening wore on, I began to understand that the relationships among these women were complex, layered, and rich with history. Their bonds were forged through shared labor, shared betrayal, and the necessity of survival in a world where they could rely only on each other. Each interaction I observed carried meaning beyond the surface. A glance, a hand placed on a shoulder, a shared smile or sigh. And as I participated, even in small ways, I could feel myself becoming entwined in this dynamic, my own presence carrying weight and consequence. I found myself lingering near Ruth as she discussed the irrigation channels, asking questions not just about efficiency, but about her decisions, her reasoning, and her thought process. She responded patiently, explaining the technicalities, but I could sense an unspoken acknowledgement in her eyes, that I was beginning to engage with her world in a meaningful way. Helena, observing from across the room, offered her input at strategic moments, guiding the conversation, correcting where necessary, but always allowing space for dialogue. Magdalene, meanwhile, interjected with humor and observation, her energy lightening the tone while reinforcing the cohesion of the group. By the time we moved to the sitting area, night had fully descended, and the fire cast a warm glow across the room. I sat quietly, reflecting on the day's work and the subtle lessons I had absorbed. The women's relationship with each other was a model of balance, strength and softness, authority and empathy, independence and interdependence. To join them fully would require more than skill with the land or knowledge of trade. It would demand sensitivity, patience, and an ability to navigate the nuances of human emotion in a highly interconnected system. As I watched them interact, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't anticipated: desire tempered by respect, curiosity tempered by caution, and the faint but unmistakable pull of intimacy. It was an emotional landscape I was only beginning to map, a territory as intricate and demanding as the farm itself. The thought that I might eventually play a meaningful role in this dynamic, both in work and in the delicate weave of their personal connections, was both exhilarating and intimidating. Lying in the guest room that night, I reflected on how much I had learned in just a few days. I had confronted debts, engaged with traders, and begun to integrate myself into the daily operations of the farm. But more profoundly, I had begun to understand the depth and complexity of the women's bonds, the history that shaped them, and the emotional intelligence required to navigate their shared life. I realized that any attempt to join them would require me to move carefully, with awareness, respect, and genuine engagement, not just with the work, but with the lives, emotions, and trust that had been cultivated long before I arrived. The night stretched on, and I felt a quiet determination settle over me. This would not be simple. It would not be easy. But if I was to remain, if I was to honor the labor, trust, and courage these women had invested in this land, I would need to embrace both the practical and emotional dimensions of this partnership fully. And for the first time, I felt that I was ready to try. The following morning, a storm rolled in from the north, draping the farm in grey skies and gusting winds. I watched from the farmhouse as the first sheets of rain battered the fields, flooding the irrigation channels and threatening the livestock. Helena was already out, coordinating adjustments to the fences and gates, her presence unwavering in the face of nature's fury. Ruth moved beside her, checking water flow and ensuring the smaller crops wouldn't drown, while Magdalene secured the animals in the barn, her voice cutting through the wind with clear, practical commands. I felt the first pang of genuine anxiety, realizing that today would test more than physical stamina or negotiation skills. It would test my emotional integration into their lives. Their teamwork, which I had admired from a distance, was now unfolding in real time under stress, and I could see the depth of their mutual reliance. Each action, each instruction, each glance carried urgency and trust. Mistakes could be costly, yet every decision was supported by the others, a seamless network of competence and care. I jumped into the work, trying to keep pace, but soon realized my presence alone could not replace years of experience and mutual understanding. As I assisted with moving cattle, adjusting gates, and reinforcing channels, I felt a mixture of pride and inadequacy. Yet, each time I faltered, Helena's calm guidance, Ruth's quiet reassurance, and Magdalene's corrective humor reminded me that I was learning, that I could contribute, and that they were willing to include me, even when the storm exposed my inexperience. By midday, the worst of the storm had passed, and the farmhouse was filled with the smell of damp earth and wet wood. We were exhausted, soaked, and covered in mud, but there was a profound sense of accomplishment. I had witnessed firsthand the power of their bond, the way they anticipated each other's moves, covered each other's weaknesses, and maintained trust even under pressure. For the first time, I realized that my role was not just functional, it was relational. I was not merely an extra pair of hands. I was beginning to become part of the emotional and practical ecosystem they had cultivated, and the recognition of that both thrilled and terrified me. Sitting by the fire that evening, drying my clothes and letting the warmth seep into my bones, I felt a subtle shift within myself. The storm had been a challenge, but it had also been an introduction to their resilience, to their reliance on each other, and to the standards I would need to meet if I were to truly belong. The pull toward connection, toward partnership in all senses of the word, had grown stronger. I knew that the next steps would require more than labor. They would require trust, honesty, and a willingness to engage with their world completely. The following week, the rhythm of the farm began to feel less like chaos and more like a symphony. I found myself rising with the sun, moving through the fields alongside Helena, Ruth, and Magdalene, each of us knowing exactly where the other would be and what tasks required attention. Today, I was assigned to manage a small trade with a neighboring settlement, a task that would test my understanding of both the business and personal trust the women had built over years. Helena reviewed the ledger with me one last time before we departed, her hand brushing mine briefly as she handed over the documents. The small gesture, almost imperceptible, carried reassurance and expectation. I realized she was trusting me, not just with financial responsibility, but with a piece of their lives, a fragment of the ecosystem they had carefully nurtured. Ruth offered me quiet encouragement, her gaze meeting mine with an understanding that seemed to say, "You belong here if you are willing to act with care." Magdalene's sharp smile reminded me to stay alert, to anticipate obstacles, and to navigate challenges with both skill and grace. The trade itself was an intricate dance of negotiation, persuasion, and patience. I found myself recalling everything I had observed, every nuance of the women's methods, and applying it with my own voice. To my surprise, the traders responded well, their initial skepticism giving way to cautious respect. I realized then that I was no longer an outsider. I was part of the operation, a functional participant whose decisions mattered. Returning to the farm, I felt a sense of quiet pride. But more than that, I felt an emotional alignment taking shape. The women welcomed me back not with judgment, but with warmth and subtle acknowledgement of my contribution. Helena, as always, maintained her composed authority, but her eyes held a softer light when she spoke to me. Ruth's gentle presence was a balm, and Magdalene's playful teasing reminded me that I was beginning to understand the texture of their shared life, the trust, the intimacy, and the delicate balance of power and affection that existed between them. As the evening descended and the fire crackled, I realized that this partnership was evolving beyond mere necessity. The labor, the strategy, and the negotiation were foundations, but the real growth lay in the emotional integration, in understanding their history, their bonds, and my potential role in them. I was learning to navigate subtle gestures, shared glances, and unspoken communication, recognizing that belonging required not just effort, but empathy, attentiveness, and courage. By the time I finally laid down to rest, I felt a quiet certainty for the first time since arriving at the property. The debts were being managed, the land was productive, and the women had begun to treat me as more than a temporary interloper. The partnership was no longer theoretical. It was alive, evolving, and rooted in both work and emotion. I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new opportunities to integrate even further. But for the first time, I felt ready, not just to participate, but to belong. The morning sunlight spilled across the fields, warm and golden, as I stepped out of the farmhouse, taking in the land that had once felt so uncertain, so foreign. Today, though, it felt alive with possibility, with the echoes of labor, laughter, and the subtle rhythms that Helena, Ruth, and Magdalene had cultivated over the years. The farm thrived not just because of careful planning and hard work, but because of the intricate human network that had been woven through it, one I was now fully a part of. I found Helena near the barn, inspecting the cattle, her gaze sharp and measured, but with an unmistakable light in her eyes when she looked at me. Ruth was tending the irrigation channels, moving with the precise, fluid motions of someone completely at home in her world, while Magdalene was checking the produce stores, her energy contagious, her laughter carrying across the yard like wind through the corn. Watching them together, I realized how much of their strength came from interdependence, from shared history, and from the unspoken trust that allowed each of them to act with freedom, knowing the others would support them. As I joined them, I felt the first full sense of belonging in a long time. We moved as a unit, seamlessly integrating my actions with theirs, and for the first time, I understood that this partnership was more than transactional. It was emotional, personal, and profoundly transformative. The boundaries of authority, affection, and respect were fluid, negotiated through daily work and subtle cues, and I was beginning to navigate them naturally. By midday, we gathered near the farmhouse, the sun high and the work momentarily paused. I watched them interact, not as a newcomer, but as someone whose presence had become meaningful. Helena offered insights on trade agreements, Ruth suggested improvements to crop rotation, and Magdalene recounted a humorous mishap with the livestock that made us all laugh. And through it all, there was a sense of harmony, a rhythm that had been missing from my life before. Later, as we sat together in the kitchen over a shared meal, I realized how much I had learned, not just about farming, business, or negotiation, but about trust, patience, and the depth of human connection. We spoke openly about plans for the future, about investments, improvements, and the possibility of expanding the farm further. But beneath the practical discussions, there was something quieter, subtler, a recognition that the bonds we had formed could sustain us through challenges, uncertainties, and the demands of life on this land. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, Helena, Ruth, Magdalene, and I stepped onto the porch together. The view stretched across fertile fields, irrigated plots, and well-kept pastures, evidence not just of labor, but of trust, respect, and shared vision. I felt a profound sense of gratitude and belonging. Here, in this remote stretch of land, we had created something far greater than the sum of its parts. A home, a partnership, and a life that honored each of our contributions, strengths, and vulnerabilities. For the first time since I had arrived, I understood that the choice I had made, to engage fully with their lives, their work, and their hearts, was the beginning of something enduring. The past, Marcus' betrayal, the debts, and the challenges had all led to this moment. And as we stood together, watching the sun dip behind the hills, I felt a quiet certainty. We were not just surviving. We were thriving, together. In that shared silence, I finally understood the truth I had been seeking all along. Belonging was not about ownership of land, nor the measure of profit. It was about trust, respect, and the willingness to build something greater than oneself. And here, with these three remarkable women, I had found exactly that. The farm, the partnership, and the bonds we had nurtured promised a future richer than I had ever imagined. And for the first time in years, I felt completely, irreversibly alive.